Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven. I'm your host, J.F. Garrard, and today our special guest is Ed.D. Jones. And Ed.D. is a USA Today bestselling author who lives in Maryland with her husband and 2 children. In her desire to see more novels with positive, sexy, and 3-dimensional African American characters as soulmates, friends, and lovers, she took on that challenge herself. Along with the fantasy romance series Forever Yours and a contemporary romance trilogy, The Styles of Love, she has authored 3 paranormal romance series, Winged Warriors, Death and Destiny, and Dragon Shifter Romance. Ed.D. is also the founder of, oh, sorry, there's something wrong with my eyes, sorry. Oh,
Okay.
okay, I'll start again, sorry. Oh. Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven. I'm your host, J.F. Garrard. Today our special guest is Ed.D. Jones. Ed.D. is a USA Today bestselling author who lives in Maryland with her husband and 2 children. In her desire to see more novels with positive, sexy, and 3-dimensional African American characters as soulmates, friends, and lovers, she took on that challenge herself. Along with the fantasy romance series Forever Yours and a contemporary romance trilogy, The Styles of Love, she has authored 3 paranormal romance series, Winged Warriors, Death and Destiny, and Dragon Shifter Romance. Ed.D. is also the founder of Kuumba Publishing, an art, audiobook, eBook, and paperback company that is a forum for creativity, with a special commitment in promoting and encouraging creative works from authors and artists of African descent. Her teenage daughter created the image design for Kuumba Publishing, while her son has written a role-playing game using original characters from a new paranormal romance series, and her husband manages the company, making Kuumba Publishing a true family affair. So welcome to Artsy Raven.
No, it was a mouthful. Thank you for reading that.
So tell me, how did all this stuff start?
Okay, so as far as the writing, it started, I think maybe I first published eBook, my novella, I believe it was in 2012. So a couple of years before that, I had gotten into reading comic books. One day my husband had told me, he said, hey, do you know that Storm of the X-Men was marrying T'Challa, King T'Challa of Black Panther? And I was like, no, oh, that sounds so cool. So I actually started picking up Black Panther, and at the time, Reginald Hudlin, they brought Marvel brought Reginald Hudlin on to pen Black Panther. And so he wrote some issues of the X-Men with Storm as a way of transitioning that character from just being an X-Men property to moving her into the Black Panther franchise. And so I love that because it was unprecedented. And even now, it's really still unprecedented. You simply don't see African American, or a lot of Black characters in that particular domain, comic books, but also as a couple. It's almost as if what we refer to as like Black love is kind of like an endangered species in some. You just don't see it that much. So I was drawn to the comic for that reason. I do like each of those characters, and that's began like my foray into the comic book world, moving into anime and things such as that. And then I just decided, hey, you know what, maybe I'll write a little bit of fan fiction. So I wrote a little bit of Black Panther and Storm fan fiction, Superman and Wonder Woman fan fiction. And so I delved into the fan fiction arena. I still read fan fiction. I think those are some of the coolest stories out there. And so that's just where I was for a few years. And I remember reading an article by an author about fan fiction, a published author. And she said, why spend so much time and effort writing stories with characters who are not your own, you don't own, when you can expend that same energy with your own characters? And I'm like, she's 100% correct. Now, the stories may have been mine, but like she said, I didn't create those characters, and I may have loved those characters as much as, because it's a great fan fiction is a great fan service. It's the one of the greatest ways in which a fan shows they really enjoy a particular franchise, a particular fandom and characters. So it's really a homage to them. But I thought she was right. I'm like, I'm spending a lot of time, and some of what I wrote, once you strung all those chapters together, they were novel length books, novella length reads. So that's just how that was my transition into stop writing fan fiction, spending a lot of time after work doing that, into creating my own stories with my own characters and having 100% control over my vision when it came to what I wanted to see and what I wanted to read.
Well, that reminds me of the 50 Shades of Grey, right? Where she was a Twilight fan fiction, and then she transitioned it. So did you do that with the fan fiction? Did you sort of replace the characters and save you a bit of writing, or did you
Well,
totally go?
I had there was one story in which it was super duper long,
Mhm.
and I took a lot of ideas from that story, and I think that goes to what the author meant. So even if you have someone else's characters, you're still creating that story. It wasn't like a something that just could be shoehorned into perhaps an existing comic book. Everything I created with the fan fiction was all my ideas, all my plots, my storylines. So I took a general idea of one of my longer stories, and I transitioned that into my Death and Destiny series, actually, which was my first full-length paranormal romance series.
Oh, yeah, it sort of reminds me of how I started. I decided to start writing a Chinese vampire story, and then I shopped it around, but I couldn't find a publisher because they told me that the vampires are only European. And they're like, our marketing people don't know what to do with this. I'm like, it's actually there's a lot of myth about vampires in Asia, you know?
Mhm.
So then that's how I started self-publishing and then opening my own company and stuff like that. Now, in your books, like when you write them, do you you have a lot of series. I mean, oh my goodness. Like how long does it take you to start writing and finish? Or
Well, man, when I write consistently, because I have a book I've been writing for the longest time now, and there's no good reason for me not to have completed it, other than that I just insert other projects. But when I write consistently, I can write a full-length novel in about 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks.
oh my
But
God.
but clearly, if
Yeah.
I'm not writing consistently, as I'm doing right now, it just stretches. I think it's just depending on how much time I'm really devoting to it. But if I write maybe 4 or 5 times a week, I can finish it, like I said, in 2 months or under.
So four times, like every time you sit down, like how long do you write?
It depends. I I I write probably at least an hour, sometimes oftentimes more. I tend to think of my writing in terms of sections. So
Hmm.
most of my chapters are divided into sections. So I may set a personal goal to say, sit down and knock out this section. And then once that section is done, I may go back and read it, do a little bit of editing. I put that aside, and then I pick up the next section. And sometimes if the whole chapter is maybe 4 or 5,000 words, and I might just get to a point where it's a stopping point. The chapter isn't done, but I've written at least 2 or 3,000 words, and that's not bad for a day for me.
Do you use any plotting at all before you write?
I do. It's I always have like a big idea wherever I want to take the story. So I don't always know when I sit down 100% of what I'm going to write in a particular section or chapter, or even everything that the book will be. But I always know before I sit down what I want to do in a particular chapter or in a section. So if it's something I need to do to move the plot forward, if it's a conversation or reveal that I need to have, I typically know those big ideas. I honestly can't sit down without some point of or some understanding of where I want to move that particular part of the story. So while I may not have all the details, I have to have enough where I feel comfortable, have a big enough idea in my head where I can sit down and say, okay, this is what you're about to do, and I can proceed from there.
Yeah, I find for me, I think the hard part is finishing. Like I start all these things, but finishing is like a different story. Like I reach the middle and I get really tired and I'm like, oh,
Uh,
okay, I'll think about it later. And then
mhm.
sometimes I don't go back to it, right? Um, so like for new writers, what kind of advice would you give people? Like, I meet a lot of people that say they all want to write, but then they just, I guess they're scared. I don't know if they're scared of starting or like if it sounds like a lot, like when you talk to people that, oh, I wrote a book, and they're like, oh my God, how do you do that? Right?
I think chunking in the way that I just described, now that's not necessarily going to work for everyone, but I think if you're starting a book and you're looking at the end, right? So if you're saying, I want a 200-page book, I want a 300-page book. Well, yeah, looking at it from having 0 pages, that can be overwhelming. But if you just take it section by section, chapter by chapter, all of those things add up to whatever it is that you have at the end. So from education, I used to teach high school. And so when you create your lesson plans, the easiest way to do it is to chunk it, because a person's brain, whether it's a minor or an adult learner, they can hold on to the information better if you put it into consumable chunks. And so I think about my writing in the same way, and it just makes it easier attainable goal when I think about it in terms of chunking. So that would be my advice to a new writer, especially someone who is afraid of what they think is this big, massive amount of time. Don't think about it that way. Think about it in really smaller terms.
Now, after you finished your first book, like, did you try to get it traditionally published, or did you know you were gonna start doing your own thing?
My first novella, that was from my Winged Warrior series, I believe that you read. That was a paranormal romance with angels and demons. And not all the angels were good and not all the demons were bad. So I didn't go that route. But that's what the first 2 books are actually novellas, and the last one is a full-length novel. So I took my first novella of Fire, Fury, Faith, and I kind of just did, like I think what most new authors do. They try, like you say, shop it around. You kind of see, and it was accepted by mainly like an online publishing company. So they accepted that one. They accepted the one that followed, and between those 2, I wrote my first full-length novel, the Death and Destiny series with Shapeshifters. So they accepted those 3. And when I wrote the second book in my Death and Destiny series, I submitted it to the same company and they accepted it. Then they accepted that book as well. And so they sent the contract, and it was the same contract they sent for the other 3 books, but I wasn't as new anymore. And so when I read the contract again, like I said, it was exactly the same, but my perspective was different. And so I looked at it and I actually just did not like the contract at all. You give so much away. And what I mean by that is they have what referred to as like the right of first refusal. And so essentially what that is that they have a right, you have to send that publishing company any books that stem from that same universe that you created. So with my Death and Destiny series, I knew with the first book that I was going to create a trilogy. And so when I read that portion of the contract, I said, okay, yeah, that means that when the second book comes out, when the third book comes out, I have a legal obligation to send them the book first, and then they'll look at it. And if they say yes, then I have to give it to them. If they say no, then then I have the right to give it to someone else, try to see if any other publishing company would be interested. So that's that right of first refusal. So when I read it for the second book, I just didn't like giving them so much, because also what it says is that they have the right to any other books within that universe, within that world. And so when I wrote my second book, I could see a sequel, and I had envisioned a sequel, and I knew exactly who the additional characters. So I added some more characters to book 2 that I knew that after that trilogy concluded, I would like to have more that would take my secondary characters and then make them primary characters, so on. But that would have also meant that would have been all those other books. So that may have been 7 or 8 books included in just because I signed the contract for that first book. And I was like, wow. I
Were
didn't
they a
like
good company? Like at that point, were you getting royalty checks or anything? Like, you know what I
it
mean?
was,
Were they reliable?
I mean, they were one of the companies, whereas they they did the cover, the editors, as you know, and they publish it, but that's kind of like it. They didn't do anything else.
Yeah,
There
no
was no
marketing.
marketing, there was no
Yeah.
pushing, which is essentially anything that I could do on my own.
Mhm.
And that's basically what I decided. So I simply asked the editor, I'm like, what's my wiggle room? Do I have a way to, maybe some things I could take out? She said, fine, write something up, send it to me. So I did. I really went through the contract with a fine tooth comb, and it was a lot that I didn't like. And so I submitted it. And she was like, yeah, no.
No, too
She's like,
much, too much.
it was too much. She was like, no, 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 we don't do that. And so she let me out. She really did. She just she let me out of the contract. And that was probably the best thing for me. And but then I'm like, okay, so now what? Because I said I probably wanted too much control. And I think sometimes if you want too much, if you want to have,
Yeah.
a lot of control over the different aspects of that process, it probably is best that maybe do some on your own. And you could be a hybrid author, and I think that's fine too. But if if you want to have control over your title, your book cover, your editor, all that stuff, you may want to consider being an indie author. And so that's what I decided to do. But I also decided to eventually make my company, I started with a sole proprietorship, and I had that for many years. And then I just, within maybe like the last 6 months, moved from sole proprietorship to an LLC, because of some other things that I put under my publishing company as well, other than just the books.
So tell me a little bit about your publishing company, because it sounds like your whole family's involved. Now, I can barely get my husband to do anything for me, so I'm very curious as to how this
Well,
happened.
I mean, I think some of the most basic involvement is just their wonderful support. My husband is very, very supportive, and so are my young adult children. And they write. My son, he's written. He has so many books that he hasn't finished, but then he has some that he wants to finish, and it is beautiful because he's a chemistry major. He just finished his undergraduate, and he's moving next week to pick up a graduate school. So he's chemistry. And I'm like, but he loves fantasy. He's beautiful with world building. He does RP stuff online. So he loves to write. And then my daughter's an artist. She started art school last year online. So she's looking forward to going face to face this year. And so it's just I have fortunate to have we're a family of diverse people who have a love for learning, love for reading, and so I was able to kind of like pull their different unique knowledge and skill set, and they're wonderful. My daughter, she'll look at one of my one of my covers, and she'll be like, oh, okay. Because she has an eye for color, and she'll tell me, you need to do this, you need to get this person. And I'm like, okay, what should I tell the cover designer again? And she's like 100% right. I mean, she just has an eye for color in art in a way that I simply don't. So some of it is in like an unofficial capacity, like that. And so we all just kind of like support each other and gather around each other. And we do that for all of us. And that's just what we do as a family. So I'm very lucky that we are able to do that for each other.
So I'm on your newsletter, and I was really curious, like when I was reading about stuff about your company, and I was reading about a sticker club. So what is your vision for all the stuff you want to do with your company?
The sticker club, I don't even know what to say about that. That is super new, and it was really a conversation I had with one of my fellow um, fantasy authors, and she tried it. She said, why don't you just try this? And so I could tell that's not even fully fleshed out. I do have some stickers, and that's so new, and I haven't really pushed it. But what I've done with the company, other than the books, is some of my covers, I've commissioned people for original concept art. And I really got into that. Some of my covers are definitely my original art. Some of them actually include original art. A piece that I'm going to read later, and I'll talk a little bit more about it when I get to Moth That's Claws. I included original artwork in that. I started a coloring book series. And so because I had all this original artwork, and I'm like, okay, so what else can I do with it? And and so I started, selling posters. And I have an Etsy shop. I actually went through the process of having my publishing brand on Amazon. So I now have an official Kuumba Publishing Amazon store, which is great. It's a lengthy process and everything. So I can sell my posters through there, all of my books. And so it's like a nice warehouse. It pulls everything together. And the overall theme is exactly what you read about Kuumba Publishing. I'm really into promoting these really wonderful and positive images of Black life, of Black characters, because you just don't see enough of that, specifically in fantasy and in paranormal. You just really don't. And I think that all that image really matters. So that's really what I push through, and that's really my brand for publishing, and also for me as Ed.D. Jones as an author as well.
Yeah, I have to admit, like, because I was talking to some people and I was asked to submit a story and they wanted high fantasy. I was like, high fantasy. They're like, the fairies, the trolls and stuff. And I was like, that's not the stuff I grew up with, but I'll try. But it's very different. Like, I don't know how to, like, it's not like the stuff that I envision is not the classic Tolkien stuff, right? So it's a challenge, I think, especially when in publishing, there's only certain stories that are told, right? And a lot of people are excluded. And I sort of understand from a business standpoint, right? Because they want to sell the stuff that they think will sell. It sold last time, so they're going to keep selling the same thing
Right.
over and over again. So I think now, hopefully, with the whole diversity push, I don't
Mhm.
know, maybe it'll help with other types of books that are coming and stuff, right?
And I think I mean, yes, that's what sold, but sometimes what sells is simply what is consistently made available.
Hmm.
So, I mean, so publishing companies, they have a lot of control over what people choose to consume, because what businesses typically do is they put stuff out there, and they create a need that people say, I never heard of this. They didn't think it was a need. So businesses do that all the time. And so, but if you want to push something, you keep pushing it, and put it in front of people. People are like, oh, okay, well, let me take a look at this. But when something that is consistently either excluded or minimized, it sends the message that it's not really important. It's not on par with these other things, because if it was, you would see more of it. We would show it to you consistently. And so that's a different message. That's the message that's not maybe explicitly told, but it's the that other layer. It is that solid message that is actually delivered. And so publishing companies, they have a big role in either pushing something or denying people access to stuff that maybe they didn't even know existed, but if you showed it to them, then they would try it.
Yeah, I hope that in the future, like when as people see, there's more diverse books that'll inspire more authors to write. When I was
Yes.
at Book Expo in New York a few years ago, I was so excited to see all these books with Asian characters on the cover,
Mhm.
and then I realized they weren't written by Asian people, which is fine, but at the same time, like it's missing like a perspective, a cultural
Yes.
perspective that's just what can I say, right? I was disappointed, and then I couldn't give it away as part of my cultural stuff. But anyhow, that's a totally different story. But I hope in the future, more new authors coming out will be a more diverse set. Um, so before we launch into your reading, can you tell us why you're using acronyms? Your ND?
Oh, I mean, it's simply because I try to separate, because I have some professional writings. So I just try
Oh,
to
okay.
separate my fiction writing from my professional writing. So it's that, but it's literally, my first initial of my first and middle name. So it truly is my name.
Yeah. Well, I did it JF Gerard. It's my husband's last name, but I did it because I write science fiction and fantasy, and I was worried that if people saw an ethnic last name, that maybe, it'll lower my chances of getting published. But it's kind of funny because one of my friends who, I mean, was now a friend, but initially when he saw the name, he was like, "Oh yeah, it's an old man. That's J.F. Gerard."
Oh,
That's
yeah,
me.
yeah, I can see that. Yeah,
So,
I could definitely see that. And
so
you know what? And that's one of those things that, as an author of color, that we have to think about. And it's so unfair, right? It's so unfair. I've had these conversations with um, other authors, and it's like, you know, what type of images do you want on your covers? Then you see my covers here, and I'm really deliberate
yeah.
about it. But I'm like, well, these are my characters. But at the same time, you want to, well, will people be turned off? And I'm it you want to tell the story you want to tell, and you shouldn't have to think about all these
Hmm.
other pieces. But it's real, and it's a barrier, and it's something that, you know, when you're author of color, that you have to be conscious of, and you have to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your what you're gonna read, and then
Sure.
into your reading?
So I have um, it's a shapeshifter trilogy, and it begins with A Queen's Pride, and it's the book you see with the lady with the lion. So that's a coming of age story. And the one I'm going to read today is the book that followed it, which is Moffat's Claws. So the character of Moffat appears. She's the goddaughter of the character that you see in A Queen's Pride. And so you learn a little bit about Moffat in A Queen's Pride. And so when I approached her book, it was to pull back the layers and tell the whole story with her. So in A Queen's Pride, you find out that you basically have this one continent, and you have humans who occupy the northern part of the continent, and you have shapeshifters, meaning but feline shapeshifters who occupy the southern tip. So if you think in terms of the United States and Canada, for example. And so in that, you found out that that continent evolved from the whole idea of manifest destiny. So the humans pushed the shifters in the northern part off their land, and they migrated to the south, which is the land for the lions, and there they stayed. So it's really, if people know anything about this country as far as the history and the treatment of the native population, a lot of that storytelling is based on what happened with that population, and just kind of like what happened with colonialism in other countries and other islands as well. And so when I look at Moffat's Claws, her story starts way back during that time, after some of her people was pushed off their land initially, so they're moving west, right? So they move the native population west, and then it's like, oh, well, we want to keep moving west. We want to build you know, train tracks. So we want this east to west coast. But wait a minute, these people are in our way, you know? So that's basically what happened. So they kept moving. So this is really her story, and what happens when, you know, you have this great power and they're just coming in and they're just mowing you down, and how do those people respond. So it goes back in time, and then it goes all the way through up to the beginning of this book, and then past the first book, and goes past that to continue her story. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, it does. It's very that's amazing actually. Very detailed. I'm just like looking on your website because I want to include the link so people can look it up after.
So it's part two, but when you read it, for probably about 90% of the book, it reads as a totally self-contained book. So it's not until like that really last third of the book in which it kind of has a time skip, and that time skip brings it up to the time period where the first book ends, and that's the bit where you start to see a bit of a switch. But for most of it, it really is a contained book. There are some characters that you meet that was in the Queen's Pride that you see in this book when they were much younger. So it's a really nice, tightly woven duology, in which I think I did a pretty good job blending those two stories into one cohesive duology. So this is the beginning of chapter 2, and in the prologue, it goes through what happened as far as their removal. Mafdet, the main character, she was not alive. Her parents lived through the removal, and so now she's on what you would consider to be like a reservation. And so she's having this conversation with her husband. So he begins, "I have faith in you." Conjuring a smile, Mafdet turned to her husband. Hondo held their little girl in long, wiry arms, perfect for hugging and climbing. At 4, Zendaya still preferred human skin contact to the feel of cheetah fur. She also favored her father's touch to that of Mafdet's. She smiled through that truthful pain, making sure to convey nothing but calm confidence. It wouldn't do for my family to know how frightened I am of disappointing them, or worse, how little interest I have in becoming one of the Swiftborn 5. Thank you for your support. Hondo shook his head and hugged Mafdet with his free arm, drawing her into his body and next to a sleeping Zendaya, whose frown revealed her displeasure at having to share her father's chest. So formal. You are Samhuri, a title and role given because I'm the only King Cheetah of our generation. Tilting her chin upward, he grazed his lips across hers. I see you, even when you seek to hide from me. Let me put our daughter to bed, then we'll speak of what troubles your mind and weighs on your heart. Instead of waiting for Hondo in the living room of their cabin home, Mafdet took refuge in their bedroom. She stripped off her pantaloons and blouse, tossing both on a rocking chair by the bedroom single window, leaving her naked. She would need neither for the shading competition. Mafdet smiled again, this one genuine. He's telling Zen her favorite cheetah story, more like Hondo's favorite story. But what Philadelphia cheetah hadn't grown up hearing tales of goddess Mafdet foot race against goddess Sekhmet? She flopped onto her bed, groaning at a lifetime of expectations that will culminate in tonight's sacred event. You are under no obligation to compete in the shading. Hondo pushed their bedroom door nearly closed, leaving enough space for Zendaya to enter if she awoke and came in search of them. If I didn't know you well, I would take so much flesh as an invitation. The foot of the bed dipped, but I do know you, and sex ranks a distant third when you're in one of your brooding moods. Less graceful in his human form, Hondo made his way up the bed and beside Mafdet, grinning at her with dark brown eyes and white teeth that sparkled. She adored the way he took her in because he did indeed see her. It had taken years of friendship for the vulnerability of being known by him to shift first into comfort, then into love. Mafdet rolled onto her side, lifting her hand to his firm, unyielding cheek. So different from his personality, gentle, patient, understanding. No wonder Zen is drawn more to him than she is to me. Or maybe she senses the truth that not even Hondo has divined. She kissed him, not with lust, but with a wife's undying devotion. Everyone expects it of me, especially my parents. You're 30 and have a child of your own. You no longer need to submit to your parents' wishes. Mafdet stared at Hondo, who, after several seconds, realized his unintended hypocrisy. We haven't had a king cheetah born since we were driven from the east. The elders viewed my birth as a sign. He returned her kiss, but with considerably more tongue play than hers. They've never said what kind of sign. Now, however, with them insisting on holding a competition only the oldest of us has ever seen, I worry the sign they saw was of an evil omen. Slayer of serpents Ruva, She was the last of the Swift-born five from life before the Philadelphia Removal Act. My parents could have named me Ruva, which would have been marginally better than being named after a goddess. What evil omen? I don't know. I'm not prophetic. Neither were the elders. Bahanda was correct. She was in a brooding mood, and the elders didn't deserve her doubts and disrespect. Yes, I'm 30, which only means my parents have waited 3 decades for an event to justify their naming choice. No one, she leaned up on an elbow, and I mean no one, is audacious enough to name their child after one of the gods, but my parents were. So here we are, married, the first king cheetah born in decades, and me named after a cheetah goddess. Of course, I must compete in the shading. Worse, I must rank in the top 5. Anything less will shame our families. Hondo pulled her onto his chest. One hand settled on her warm back, the other in hair she'd braided for the competition. If she became one of the Swift-born five, she would have to wear her hair in a scorpion tail braid, the style worn by the nation's sworn protectors. I dislike scorpions, but I despise snakes. Ruva must have been one skilled warrior if she was bestowed with the title of Slayer of Serpents. Shame is too strong of a word, but your concern is well-founded. We place too much weight on traditions. Our culture is all we have, culture and each other. Without both, we are little more than empty vessels who don't realize they are dead. Hondo tipped up her chin. Tell me again why I married such a gloomy woman? With a swat to her backside and then a playful pinch, he smiled down at her. Yes, now I remember. I do love the way this moves when you walk and the way it feels when we make love. I guess I'll keep you. I can stop there. I'm not sure if I did 10 minutes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your story and being on our podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate that very much.
So where can people find you? You have a website? Are you on social media at all?
I am. My website is nddjonesparanormalpleasure.com. I am on Facebook, so it's N.D. Jones author. Same thing on Instagram, N.D. Jones author. Pinterest as well, N.D. Jones, and Twitter. So N.D. Jones or N.D. Jones author. Try to be consistent as much as.
No, it's good because half the time I'm like looking up people's names and I can't find them, and it's because it's a different handle everywhere, so it's better to have one handle. So yeah.
So definitely on all those different social medias, and I also have a N.D. Jones on. I have YouTube, so I have my book trailers and a couple of few podcasts and readings that I've done on there as well.
Well, awesome. So thank you once again, and we will talk again later. Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarage.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there's bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.